Good afternoon. You're all joining me on a not so lovely afternoon on Saturday. I did actually do this video yesterday, and it was a lovely day. There wasn't apocalyptic bird flocks flying around and rain clouds, but I had an equipment failure with the GoPro, so I've got lots of audio of me doing a review of this lovely bike, which I'll come to in a second, but no video. So we're doing it again, but hopefully practice makes perfect, so I'll do it even better this time, assuming I did it well the first time. So what do we have today? We have a 1987 Honda VFR400R, and it's the NC24 model. The VFR range is Honda's V4 engine sports bike range. It was born out of Honda's wish to push the V4 engine as their preferred choice for racing and, as a result, for a range of road bikes. It was in the early 80s, late 70s where V4 engines were being explored by Honda. They initially launched, alongside their race bikes, a range of VF sports bikes, which I believe there was a 400, 500, 1000, and there was a VF750 Sabre as well. I think that might have just been a US model, but they were good bikes apparently, nice engine, rode well, but they had reliability issues. That was due to incorrect tolerances on the chain-driven cams, which caused the engines to, on the fair regular, lunch themselves. You can still find the VF bikes around, but you have to be a bit careful about which ones you buy and how they've been maintained, but most of the problems would probably have been sorted by now. But as you can imagine, this reputation for slightly sketchy reliability caused issues for Honda's new V4 engine format. So to counter that, they launched the VFR range, which was significantly re-engineered, all new basically, and they changed the chain-driven cams in the engine to a gear-driven cam. Those gear-driven cams give the VFR range a distinctive sound and also a stellar reputation for reliability. So Honda well and truly countered that reputation for bad reliability in the V4 ranges. When the VFR range was launched, there was the 750 and the 400, and obviously I am looking at the 400 today. The initial VFR 400 was actually an NC21 model, quite similar to the NC24 that I've got today, except it was a slightly different engine and it was a double-sided swing arm, whereas the NC24 had an updated engine and it has a single-sided swing arm, so it looks just a little bit posher and the engine is just a little bit nicer. So let's talk about the specs of the NC24 VFR. It has a 399cc V4 engine, as we discussed, with gear-driven cams. That outputs about 59 horsepower and about 28.8, I think, foot-pounds of torque. That is pushing along a relatively light, dry weight of 165 kilos. That goes up to about 195 kilos, fully fueled and with oil and fluids in. It has conventional forks and a single shock. It's a similar layout to what you would see in most modern sports bikes. It's pushing along a 100 section front tyre and a 130 section rear tyre, and that's got a single-sided swing arm. It's all carburetor fed, electric start, 6-speed gearbox and chain drive. The brakes are 2-pot Nissin calipers, and that's double disc on the front and single disc on the rear. So there's nothing too out of the ordinary in compared to modern sports bikes. The only thing that really sets it apart from its contemporaries and slightly later bikes is that it has that gear-driven cam V4 engine, as up until recently all VFR engines used to have. So that's enough chatting about what it is. Let's get riding and then talk about how it feels. And God forbid this time I won't be chatting to myself for an hour to get home and find that the camera or the sound didn't work. Wish me luck. Well, before we even get moving, you've just heard the one thing that really is the piece de resistance of the VFR range. The engine. It sounds mega if you do the right things. Right, let's get moving. So as you get riding, there are two things that really jump out at you initially. The first is that the engine is a little bit more tractable and has a little bit more power low down than you might expect for a 400cc engine. In fact, in the lower half of the rev range, it seems to even outpace some of the later 600 sports bikes where everything was totally stacked at the top end of the rev range. The second thing that you notice is that inputs are incredibly light. It's a very maneuverable bike, and yet it doesn't feel particularly flighty or nervous. So it's a curious mixture of incredibly light steering, but also quite a steady composure. All the controls feel nice and tight and responsive. There's no fluffing at the lower parts of the rev range. There's no haziness in the response when you're at medium to small throttle openings. The clutch is nice and light, it engages well. The only thing that really dates the feeling of the ride of this bike is the brakes. I can't get any real bite out of them. New pads don't make much of a difference. Changing the fluid didn't make an enormous amount of difference. There is power there, but you have to put an enormous amount of your own hydraulic pressure in order to get that response out of them. So it requires more effort than a modern bike would do. So when you squeeze the brakes, they start to brake, but there's not an initial grab or initial bite that really gives you that full confidence. The gearbox is really sweet. I don't think I've ever got a false neutral or a fluffed up gear change because of this box. And it rev matches just perfectly. The throttle response is just what you need, which is great because most of the thrill of this bike is slamming it into the upper half of the rev range, which, let me show you. Woohoo! That's the other thing you notice about the engine. There's a reasonable amount of power low down, but there's also a surprising amount of power in the upper half of the rev range. 59 horsepower, especially these days, doesn't really seem like all that much to write home about. In fact, you'll get more out of the middleweight 600s of about 10, 15 years later, but it's not pushing along all that much weight. 195 kilos isn't absolute featherweight, but it is light, and it's significantly less than some of the later bikes. But especially now that bikes are getting heavier again, this just manages to feel super responsive. It also helps that the noise it makes is straight out of MotoGP. So it makes you feel like you're really revving the hell out of it. And you've got that nice 14,000 RPM rev range, and you have a really direct connection to everything. Not that I'm going to do all that much of it today, but this bike really loves to lean. Probably a lot of that's down to the modern rubber that's on it, but you never feel like you're leaning over too far. It never feels like it wants to either tip into the corner or that it resists you. And because it's so light and so responsive, it will change line easily when you need it to do so. All of it just adds up to a bike that has a very responsive and quite modern feeling. If you compare this to some of the bikes that were coming before it, especially late 70s and early 80s sports bikes, this really just feels like a different level, and it feels very similar to bikes you'll ride today. In some respects better, in some respects worse. Now this particular bike has a slight annoying issue, which is a flat spot at about 8,000 to 9,000 RPM. It's nothing that can't be bypassed and you can ride around it, but so I'm told it's fairly common, as these can be a little bit pernickety to set up, especially since I've changed out the original exhaust and it's got a new air filter, so that probably is going to lean this bike out somewhat. You have more than enough power to overtake. So I think that gives you a generally good idea of how this bike feels to ride. But but let's really sort of boil it down. What are the highlights of this bike? Well, the most obvious one is really the centerpiece of the bike, and that is the feel and the sound of the engine. It just feels so flipping good. And 400cc is a little bit of a sweet spot size of an engine too, because it can give you enough power and the rev range for it to feel exciting, but it's just perfectly judged for the road, because you've got a top speed of 130 miles an hour, which, you know, not all that fast. And if you compare it to even just a modern 600, where you're putting out nearly, well, getting on for nearly twice the power, and you're going to be getting well over 160 miles per hour with very long first gears. So things start to get too fast for the road to enjoy properly quite quickly. And 400cc is not one of those sizes. It just feels perfectly judged. The other highlight of the bike is just the handling. Everything just feels perfect. The suspension is not too crashy, but it's not too soft. The bike is light. The response to inputs are clean and quick. It's just a wonderful little machine to ride. And something I didn't mention earlier is, another highlight is the looks. Although this isn't an NC30, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, it is still a cracking looking machine, especially with this fag packet paint scheme and the single-sided swing arm. There's just some gorgeous little details to this bike that set it out. Like the single-sided swing arm at the time, that would have been very, very trick, not something you see at all. And it's a nice little connection to the endurance racing aspect of the VFR range. I think that's where they were inspired from. There are also other little details, like the fuel tap. The fuel tap selector is like a really nice, I don't know if it's cast or if it's CNC'd, but it's just a really lovely kind of metal thing built into the side of the tank, and it looks lovely. And it feels good to use. It's easy to find when you go onto reserve. Then you've got the integrated lights, a nice, although, you know, some might argue that it makes it look a little dated the way they've been put in, but the indicators and everything like that, that's all been integrated into the rear tail cluster and into the fairing here. Gives it a nice clean look. And all of these little details of the engine, they make the bike feel a little bit special, especially considering the fact that it's a 400cc Japanese import. So you don't see an enormous amount of these around. They were never actually sold in the UK. You will get looks, you will get comments, and it does feel a little bit special. Another highlight is that it doesn't cost much to run these. They're generally quite reliable in all of the places that matter. You don't have to worry about cam chain tensioners. The engine is very reliable. It's going to go for miles and miles and miles without any major issues. The VFR range is well renowned for its robust engines. Consumables don't cost very much because you've got low weight, not all that much power. Chains, tyres, brakes, they all last for a long time. Fuel economy is not too bad. It's about 55 miles per gallon. That's the sort of mixed range of riding that I got out of this, which, in comparison to other bikes at the time and even some modern bikes, pretty damn good. I don't find it uncomfortable at all, which is strange. Small bike. I'm a relatively tall guy, about 6 foot. Certainly not out of the average though. And although my legs are a little bit folded up, not too much, my wrists, I can ride on these bars for a long time, not feel bad. The seat itself is surprisingly comfortable. Yes, it's a small bike. It's not going to be a touring bike at any point, but as a general commuter, not a problem at all. So at the risk of me sounding like I'm just giving this thing absolutely glowing reviews wherever I'm going, there are some significant lowlights to the bike, so let's discuss those. Number one for me is that although this is, on the whole, a very reliable bike, there are a few little gremlins that make it feel a little bit pernickety and a little bit diva-ish. And some of it is just general things that you would find in any bike, but the problems are compounded by the format of the bike. So any bike of this age is going to start to get some kind of electrical issues. And as you can see, in comparison to the 750 range, this bike has been built down to a price. Some items are a little bit cheaper than you would find on the 750 range, and the fairing panels are not as well protected, so items are not as well protected from the elements. And by this age, you're going to start to get some electrical faults. Some of them are very common, like the regulator rectifier, a common fault on all Hondas. The one on this one went, but in order to replace it, you would think that normally they would be placed somewhere by the rear frame underneath underneath one of the rear fairings, but that is not the case. On this bike, the regulator rectifier is under the tank on a spar that you have to remove, which necessitates taking off the tank, disconnecting the fuel, blah 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 blah. It's a bit of a pain in the bum, and the same goes for almost every component you can think of. It's a very compact little engine, and the cylinders point towards each other, so anytime you need to get to the carbs, pain to get off. Anytime you need to get to the spark plugs, you need to get the radiator off, and you need to get the seat off and get through the rear subframe. Then there are other fairly common little niggles, like the fuel tap. One of the issues with the fuel tap is it will just suddenly decide that it wants to ignore whether there is a vacuum being created or not. It will just start to leak fuel into the carbs. And then those carbs will overflow, and then they'll go into the cylinders. And before you know it, please excuse me, I got entirely distracted by having too much fun there. What I started to say before I got distracted was that the fuel tap will go and it will decide that it wants to leak fuel whether or not there is a vacuum present. So that will leak into the carbs, they will overflow, then the cylinders will fill with fuel, and then you've got a hydro-locked bike. It hasn't happened to me on this example, but it did happen to me on a previous Cafe Racer NC24 that I had. And then that means that you have to disconnect the tank again, get to the spark plugs, remove the radiator, then pull over the engine via the crank or via the wheel, exit the fuel from the cylinders, then you have to do an oil change, check the gaskets to make sure that nothing's being eaten away out. Then you have to always remember to keep the fuel tap on off. It's just a niggling little detail that you can fix. You can get kits for the fuel taps and what have you, or you get a new fuel tap. But then that brings us on to another maintenance lowlight of the VFR400. Being a Japanese import, being older, having never been sold in the UK, you're going to find it a little bit more difficult than you'd like to either find the knowledge on how to fix what your problem is, or B, to find the parts. There are some fantastic Facebook groups and forums out there that will help you, and trust me, they are brilliant. But even then, finding parts can be a pain. Like, I was looking for an NC24 tank on the last one I had. The only one I could find was £400 for a fuel tank. Utterly mental. And then you'll be spending all this money, time and effort to keep this bike going, And although it does feel special and it is a lovely import and it's a great machine, it is not an NC30. And those are the bikes that really retain the value and that people really want. And they will be similar in terms of effort and cost to maintain, although possibly even cheaper, because they were officially sold in the UK by Honda. Not in huge amounts, because they were very expensive for what they were at the time. But an NC24 is not an NC30, so you will probably put similar time and possibly more cost into maintaining it, with not much in the way of an increasing value in comparison to the money that you're spending. That's not to say that this bike is not satisfying to maintain, and it's not like it's going to give you enormous problems, but they will present itself purely because of the age of the bike, and quite often because the 400 will have been owned by younger people back in the day, and they won't have taken care of it as much. Oh yeah, final low light, the brakes. I know I mentioned them earlier, they're just not very good. They're not terrible, but they're not that good. If you were trying to get hold of one of these, or looking for alternatives, there are a few about. There's more of these around, probably more NC21s than NC24s. Less NC24s around than NC30s, but the purchase price will be a lot cheaper. So starting at the lower range, working but not in spectacular condition, such as this one, it's going to be about 1,500 quid to 2,000 pounds. That'll get you one with an MOT, with a few little maintenance jobs to do, but it's going to look a little bit shabby. If you want one that looks nice, goes nice, doesn't need an enormous amount done to it, then you're probably looking more at 2.5 to 3k. And finally, if you want absolutely mega pristine, there's a guy that I know, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he takes NC24s, strips everything back to his component parts, refreshes everything, and basically builds a brand new NC24. That is about 4 to 4.5k. So if you want like a totally, almost out of the factory one, that's probably what you're looking at. And to be honest, 4K is where the NC30s even start if you want to look at ones that are even worth it. So that gives you an idea. In terms of alternatives, there's plenty around a similar value. There's the Kawasaki ZXR400, there's the GSXR400, there's a FZR400 from Yamaha. And they're all good, all nice bikes. So the GSXR and the Kawasaki probably have worse build quality and finish than the VFR. There's even some earlier CBR 400s, and again, they're nice. But none of them feel quite as special as the V4 engine does, especially a small format V4 engine. That really does feel very nice. So yeah, there's a lot around, but then obviously at the 1,500 to 2.5 or 1,500 to 3k range, then, you know, a lot of what you're going to be looking at is actually just more modern 600s. And if you're looking purely in terms of performance, 600s win every time. You're going to have to be wanting a VFR400. So really, if you're looking at a VFR400, generally there isn't going to be much else that you're going to be wanting to look for. You do have to be careful when buying to look for decent maintenance records. You don't want to buy one by someone who hasn't done anything at all or doesn't know what they're doing. These are bikes that need to be, especially by now, need to be owned by people that are used to dealing with bikes of this age and with this kind of technology. Let's summarize this little machine. In my opinion, it's a great buy, but there are some caveats to it. It's relatively cheap. It's not overly desirable, but it is more desirable than similar vintage competing bikes like the inline 4s. And you can get them at a range of prices to suit your budget, which is good. The handling is fantastic. The engine sounds and feels wonderful. It's not particularly uncomfortable. It's cheap to run. Many pluses. It's nice, special, and you always have that little kudos of having a nice 80s Japanese import. But, and it's quite a significant but, is due to the age of the bike and the fact that it's been built down to a price in comparison to other models in the range, you're going to have to be relatively comfortable maintaining the bike. You need to be willing to get the spanner out, and you need to be willing to chase down little gremlins and actively engage with the community, because some of the information you're going to need to find out is not going to be so obvious as more common bikes. But if that's your bag, I really cannot stress enough that buying a VFR400 is a fantastic thing to do. Buy the best one you can for your budget. If you can sneak up to the NC30, give that one a go. It is a little bit more race orientated than this one, but they're all, any of the VFR400s in the range are going to be fantastic. Anyway, this is Pete doing the VFR400 review for the second time, and hopefully I got it right this time. I'm going to peace out now and leave you to a little bit of the soundtrack of this VFR. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I hope it's cleared up some questions you might have had about the VFR400 if you're looking to buy one. I'll see you next time.